The glaring white lights of the intensive care unit buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets, masking the steady, desperate rhythm of a failing heart monitor, while a man who had spent his entire life under the boundless golden Texas sun was slowly suffocating in a windowless room forgotten by a world that only valued what it could sell. The contrast was immediate and devastating. On one side of the glass, there was the sterile, unforgiving whiteness of the city hospital, a monument to modern medicine and cold bureaucracy, where the air smelled sharply of bleach iodine and calculated indifference. On the other side, trapped within the fragile, failing vessel of an old rodeo cowboy named Elias, was the memory of the earth. If you looked closely at the deep lines etched into his weathered face, you could almost smell the sweet, heavy scent of rain hitting the dry Texas dirt. You could almost hear the rhythmic thud of heavy leather boots walking across worn wooden floorboards, and the distant, melancholic whinny of a wild Mustang learning to trust a gentle hand. Elias was a man who had built his life on the solid foundation of hard labor and unwavering faith. For 60 years he had worked the ranches of the southern plains, mending fences in the blistering heat, breaking horses with a patience that bordered on the divine and living by a code of honor that required no written contract. His hands, now resting weakly on the thin, starchy hospital sheets, were thick and heavily calloused, a roadmap of a lifetime spent gripping leather reins and swinging heavy iron hammers. Those hands had pulled calves from the mud, had folded in silent prayer every Sunday morning, and had tipped a worn cowboy hat to every stranger he ever met. But in this towering metropolitan hospital, those hands meant nothing. To the men in tailored suits and crisp white coats who walked the halls with clipboards and digital tablets, Elias was not a builder of the American frontier. He was simply a bed number. He was an unprofitable patient with a rare complication, a drain on the resources of an elite institution that catered to the wealthy and the powerful. The architect of this daily humiliation was Dr. Vance, the chief administrator of the intensive care floor. Vance was a man who wore his medical degree like a crown and his spotless white coat like a suit of armor against the messy, emotional realities of human suffering. He moved through the corridors with a brisk, impatient stride, his eyes constantly scanning the monitors and the charts, never stopping to look at the faces of the people lying in the beds. To Vance, the hospital was a machine, and patients like Elias were rusty cogs slowing down the gears. The old cowboy had been transferred to the city due to a sudden and severe respiratory collapse, a condition that required specialized equipment only available in this fortress of glass and steel. But from the moment Elias arrived, the hospital had stripped him of his dignity. They took away his flannel shirts, his worn denim, his silver belt buckle, and replaced them with a flimsy gown that left him shivering in the over-air-conditioned room. They took away the natural light he had lived by, substituting it with a harsh, relentless artificial glare that made his pale skin look gray. Worst of all, they were trying to take away his family. Elias had a granddaughter named Sarah, a young woman who had inherited his fierce loyalty and his quiet strength. Sarah had exhausted every meager saving she had just to secure his place in this hospital, but she was entirely out of her depth in the face of the urban elite. She sat in the waiting room day after day, a solitary figure in faded jeans and scuffed boots, clutching a worn-out leather Bible and a plastic bag containing a few old cassette tapes. Those tapes were Elias's only comfort. They were filled with the classic country melodies of his youth, the honest storytelling of men who understood the value of a hard day's work and the grace of a loving God. But Dr. Vance had instituted draconian visitation rules under the guise of medical protocol. He had instructed his staff to limit Sarah's time in the room to a mere 15 minutes a day, arguing that the presence of rural relatives disrupted the pristine environment of his ward. On this particular afternoon, the cruelty of the system reached its breaking point. Sarah stood at the marble reception desk, her hands trembling, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She was begging the head nurse for just a few more minutes with her grandfather. Elias was fading fast. The doctors had quietly admitted that there was nothing more they could do and that his body was simply shutting down. Sarah knew that the end was near, and she could not bear the thought of her grandfather dying alone, surrounded by the beeping of machines instead of the voices of his loved ones. She pleaded with the nurse, explaining that Elias was terrified of the cold and the quiet, that he needed to hear the familiar sounds of the music he loved to find peace. Dr. Vance happened to be walking past the desk, reviewing a digital chart. He stopped, sighed heavily, and stepped forward, his face a mask of patronizing irritation. He looked at Sarah not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a nuisance. He adjusted his glasses and spoke in a tone that was soft but laced with absolute contempt. He told her that the hospital was a place of science and healing, not a honky-tonk bar. He stated that her grandfather was heavily medicated and likely unaware of his surroundings, making her presence unnecessary and disruptive. He coldly informed her that the rules applied to everyone regardless of their emotional state, and that if she could not compose herself, she would be asked to leave the premises entirely. Sarah felt the air rush out of her lungs. The sheer injustice of the moment was paralyzing. She looked toward the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit, knowing that just down that sterile hallway, her grandfather, the man who had taught her how to ride, how to pray, and how to stand tall in the face of adversity, was lying in a cold bed, treated with less respect than a discarded piece of equipment. She felt entirely powerless. The city had won. The cold, hard reality of money and status had crushed the simple, dignified life they had built on the ranch. She clutched the plastic bag of cassette tapes to her chest, lowered her head, and began to weep silently, the tears falling onto the polished marble floor like rain on dry pavement. It was in this moment of profound vulnerability and absolute despair that the atmosphere in the hospital lobby began to shift. It did not happen with a loud announcement or a sudden commotion. It happened with a quiet, steady rhythm. The heavy glass automatic doors at the main entrance slid open, letting in a brief gust of warm Texas wind and the distant hum of city traffic. But the sound that cut through the sterile silence of the lobby was the deliberate, measured click of heavy leather boots walking across the floor. The security guards stationed near the entrance straightened up their hands, instinctively reaching for their radios. The nurses behind the desk paused their typing. Even Dr. Vance, who was turning to walk away, stopped and looked toward the entrance, annoyed by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Walking toward the reception desk was a man who looked entirely out of place in the gleaming modern facility, yet possessed a presence so commanding that the room seemed to shrink around him. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, neatly pressed dark jeans, and a pair of beautifully crafted cowboy boots that bore the subtle scuffs of genuine use. On his head, resting with perfect ease, was a classic Stetson hat, casting a shadow over a face that was known to millions, but carried the humble, weathered grace of a man who still knew how to saddle his own horse. It was George Strait. Beside him, walking with a quiet dignity and a radiant warmth that seemed to defy the coldness of the hospital, was Dolly Parton. She was dressed elegantly but without the usual theatrical flash of a stage performance. Her presence was maternal, deeply grounded, and exuded an aura of profound empathy. There was no entourage. There were no cameras. There were no publicists rushing ahead to clear the way. There were only two legendary figures walking side by side, carrying the weight of a culture built on respect, faith, and the unbreakable bond of community. Weeks ago, in a moment of desperate hope, Sarah had written a letter. She had poured her heart out onto a piece of notebook paper, describing her grandfather's life, his unwavering goodness, his quiet faith, and his deep love for the traditional country music that had soundtracked his decades of hard work. She had sent the letter to a fan club address, a shot in the dark, an attempt to bring a small piece of joy to a dying man. She never expected a reply. She certainly never expected the king of country himself and the beloved queen of the mountains to drop everything across the state and walk through the front doors of a hostile city hospital. George and Dolly approached the desk. The silence in the lobby was absolute. The receptionist, a young woman who usually enforced the hospital's strict rules with robotic efficiency, sat frozen, staring wide-eyed at the two icons standing before her. George stopped a few feet from the counter. He reached up and, with a slow, respectful motion, removed his Stetson, holding it against his chest. His eyes calm, steady, and holding a depth of wisdom that commanded instant respect, met the receptionist's gaze. He spoke, and his voice was exactly as it sounded on the records, deep, resonant, and profoundly comforting. He offered a polite greeting, calling the young woman Ma'am, and quietly stated that they were there to visit a friend named Elias in room 412. The receptionist stammered, her hands hovering over her keyboard, unable to process the reality of the situation. Before she could figure out how to navigate the strict visitation protocols, Dr. Vance stepped forward. The administrator's ego was a fragile thing, easily threatened by anyone who commanded more authority in his domain than he did. He recognized the visitors immediately, but instead of feeling honored, he felt a surge of territorial anger. He saw them not as human beings offering an act of kindness, but as a disruption to his perfectly ordered world, a potential media circus that threatened to undermine his control. Vance puffed out his chest and walked to the front of the desk, placing himself directly between George Strait and the doors to the intensive care unit. He adjusted his coat and spoke in a voice dripping with condescension. He acknowledged who they were, but immediately followed it with a lecture. He stated that this was a highly secure medical facility dealing with critical patients, not a backstage meet and greet. He informed them that Elias was in no condition to receive visitors, let alone entertain celebrities, and that the hospital's strict rules regarding visitation were not subject to change simply because famous musicians decided to drop by for a publicity stunt. The insult hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Sarah, who was standing just a few feet away, felt a fresh wave of horror wash over her. It was not enough that Dr. Vance had humiliated her and stripped her grandfather of his dignity. Now he was insulting the very people who had come to offer a shred of grace in their darkest hour. She expected George to turn away to avoid a confrontation, to decide that the hassle was not worth it. But George Strait did not move. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or show a single flicker of anger. The Texas values that defined him, the deep-rooted Christian belief in defending the vulnerable and standing up to arrogance, remained steadfast. He looked at Dr. Vance with a gaze so steady and piercing that the administrator actually took a half-step backward. George's silence was a masterclass in quiet power. He let Dr. Vance's words evaporate into the sterile air, exposing them for the petty cruelties they were. Then George spoke. His tone was perfectly polite, yet carried the unyielding weight of a mountain. He told Dr. Vance that they were not there for a show. He explained that they had come to pay their respects to a man who had spent his entire life building the fences, paving the roads, and working the land that allowed men like the doctor to live in comfort. He stated with absolute clarity that Elias was a man of honor who deserved to leave this world with dignity, surrounded by the respect he had earned through a lifetime of sweat and honest labor. Dolly stepped forward, her presence softening the intense standoff, but adding an undeniable emotional weight. She looked directly into Dr. Vance's eyes, her expression filled with a sorrowful pity for a man who had so completely lost touch with his own humanity. She spoke softly, telling the doctor that rules were meant to protect people, not to isolate them in their final hours. She gently reminded him that beneath all the machines and the charts, there was a human soul waiting to go home to the Lord, and that no earthly protocol should stand in the way of a peaceful crossing. The confrontation was not a shouting match. It was a collision of two entirely different worldviews. On one side, the cold, calculated arrogance of an elite system that valued efficiency over empathy. On the other, the enduring spirit of the country, a spirit that believed in the sanctity of the individual, the importance of community, and the sacred duty to comfort the dying. Dr. Vance's face flushed red. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, and certainly not with such articulate, calm authority. He felt the eyes of his entire staff on him, the nurses, the security guards, the patients in the waiting room. Everyone was watching. He knew he was losing control of the situation. In a desperate attempt to reassert his dominance, he signaled to two large security guards standing near the elevator, instructing them to escort the visitors out of the building, citing a violation of hospital policy and a threat to patient safety. The guards' heavy-set men in dark uniforms hesitated. They looked at Dr. Vance, and then they looked at George Strait. George simply stood there, his hat still resting over his heart, his posture relaxed but immovable. He was not a man looking for a fight, but he was clearly a man who would not be moved by unjust intimidation. The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah held her breath, praying silently, gripping her faded Bible until her knuckles turned white. It was in this moment of peak conflict that the rigid structure of the hospital began to fracture from within. A veteran nurse named Margaret, who had been quietly tending to Elias for the past 2 weeks and who had witnessed every cruel dismissal handed down by Dr. Vance, stepped out from behind the reception desk. Margaret was a woman who had seen decades of life and death and who knew the difference between healing a body and honoring a soul. She had watched Elias stare blankly at the ceiling. She had seen the tears leak from the corners of his eyes when the pain medication wore off, and she knew exactly what Dr. Vance was doing to the old man's spirit. Margaret walked directly past Dr. Vance, completely ignoring his sharp command for her to return to her station. She approached the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit, pulled her security badge from her scrubs, and swiped it against the digital reader. The machine emitted a sharp beep and the heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud clack. Margaret pushed the doors open, holding one wide. She turned back to George and Dolly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and simply nodded. The power had shifted not through force or loud arguments, but through the undeniable moral authority of doing what was right. Dr. Vance was left standing in the middle of the lobby, his authority crumbling around him, entirely powerless to stop the tide of human decency that had just breached his fortress. The security guards stepped back, lowering their heads in silent agreement with the nurse's rebellion. George Strait turned to Sarah. He offered her a gentle, reassuring smile, the kind of smile that promised that everything was finally going to be all right. He gestured for her to walk with them. Sarah, clutching her plastic bag of tapes, stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling a profound sense of awe and gratitude. Together, the three of them walked past the defeated administrator and stepped through the open doors into the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the intensive care unit, leaving the cold bureaucracy of the city behind them. The heavy magnetic doors of the intensive care unit closed behind them with a definitive hollow thud, sealing out the noise of the lobby and plunging them into the hushed mechanical purgatory of the hospital's most critical wing. Out there in the waiting room, there was at least the illusion of life, the shuffling of feet, the ringing of telephones, the murmur of anxious conversations. But in here, the silence was oppressive. It was a silence manufactured by thick glass walls and sound-absorbing ceiling tiles, broken only by the synchronized rhythmic beeping of life support machines and the soft hiss of oxygen valves. The air in the corridor was freezing, heavily filtered, and saturated with the sharp chemical scent of rubbing alcohol and iodine. It was an environment designed to keep death at bay by stripping away everything that made life warm and unpredictable. Yet as George Strait and Dolly Parton walked down that long, sterile hallway alongside a trembling Sarah, the atmosphere began to undergo a miraculous transformation. It was as if they had brought the very soul of the Texas hill country inside with them. The cold, fluorescent lights shining down on the polished linoleum floor seemed to soften. The sharp, medicinal smells were momentarily overpowered by the faint, earthy scent of worn saddle leather cedar wood and the crisp, clean aroma of a mountain breeze that seemed to follow Dolly wherever she went. The deliberate, measured sound of George's boots striking the floor echoed down the corridor, not as a disruption, but as a steady, reassuring heartbeat. It was the sound of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly where he was going, a man who walked with the righteous authority of someone who feared God and respected the working man. Nurses in their blue scrubs paused in their rounds, stepping out of the doorways of glass-walled rooms to watch the procession. They stood in stunned silence, their clipboards lowered, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were accustomed to seeing wealthy donors, arrogant specialists, and terrified families walking these halls. They were not accustomed to seeing royalty. But George and Dolly did not carry themselves like royalty. They did not look straight ahead, ignoring the staff. As they passed each nurse, George would offer a slow, polite nod of his head, his eyes acknowledging their hard work, his face reflecting a quiet gratitude for the burden they carried. Dolly, with her radiant maternal grace, offered soft, gentle smiles that seemed to reach out and embrace the exhausted workers. In those brief, silent exchanges, they restored a sense of humanity to a space that had been entirely consumed by clinical detachment. Sarah walked between them, feeling as though she were moving through a dream. Her legs felt heavy as lead, and her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She gripped her faded leather Bible and the plastic bag of cassette tapes so tightly, her fingers ached. Just an hour ago, she had been a powerless girl from a dusty ranch, treated like an ignorant nuisance by a man who held her grandfather's final days in the palm of his manicured hand. Now she was being escorted down the hallway of her tormentors by two of the most beloved figures in American history. Dolly noticed the young woman's trembling. Without a word, the legendary singer reached out and gently looped her arm through Sarah's. The physical contact was electric. Dolly's touch was warm, grounding, and fiercely protective. She leaned in slightly and spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, a voice that sounded like a lullaby sung on a porch at twilight. She told Sarah to take a deep breath, to hold her head up high, and to remember that the love she had for her grandfather was stronger than any rule, any doctor, or any building made of glass and steel. They reached the end of the corridor and stopped in front of room 412. The blinds were partially drawn, but through the glass they could see Elias. The sight of the old cowboy was enough to break the hardest of hearts. The man who had once wrangled wild mustangs and carried massive wooden fence posts on his shoulders now looked impossibly small, lost amidst a sea of white sheets and tangled plastic tubing. His skin was pale and papery, stretched tight over the sharp angles of his cheekbones. His chest rose and fell with a shallow, ragged effort, aided by a machine that pushed air into his failing lungs. His eyes were closed, and his face was etched with a grimace of lingering pain and profound exhaustion. He looked like a mighty ancient oak tree that had finally succumbed to a relentless winter storm. Sarah let out a stifled sob, pressing her hand over her mouth. The reality of her grandfather's condition hit her with renewed force. She felt Dolly's arm tighten around her, offering a silent anchor in the storm of her grief. George stood before the glass, his jaw set, his eyes taking in the scene with a profound, sorrowful reverence. He did not see a broken-down old man or a drain on hospital resources. He saw a brother. He saw a man whose sweat had watered the earth, whose calloused hands had built the foundations of the country they both loved. He saw a life of quiet dignity that was being suffocated by the cold indifference of the city. Nurse Margaret, who had led them down the hall, stepped forward and gently pushed the heavy glass door open. The sound of the heart monitor grew louder, a frantic, erratic beep that filled the small room. George stepped through the doorway first. He did not hesitate. He did not look at the complex medical machinery or the bags of intravenous fluids hanging from metal poles. His focus was entirely on the man in the bed. He walked to the right side of the mattress, stopped, and slowly, deliberately removed his Stetson, holding it over his heart. He bowed his head for a brief, silent moment of prayer, asking the Lord to grant peace to the soul resting before him. Dolly guided Sarah into the room, guiding her to the left side of the bed. Sarah immediately dropped to her knees beside her grandfather, resting her cheek against his frail arm, her tears soaking into the thin hospital gown. She whispered his name over and over, her voice cracking with a mixture of desperate love and overwhelming sorrow. Elias stirred. The sound of his granddaughter's voice pierced through the heavy fog of medication and exhaustion. His eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of his failing body. Slowly, agonizingly, he opened his eyes. His vision was blurred, the harsh fluorescent lights directly above him, burning his retinas. He blinked, trying to focus. He felt Sarah's tears on his arm, and he managed to move his hand just enough to rest his trembling fingers against her hair. He tried to speak, to tell her not to cry, but his throat was dry, and the oxygen mask muffled his voice. Then he noticed the figure standing on the other side of the bed. At first, Elias thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He thought the heavy doses of morphine were finally conjuring visions from his past. Standing over him was a man whose face he had seen on album covers for decades, a man whose voice had kept him company on thousands of lonely nights, driving a beat-up truck down endless dirt roads. He smelled the distinct scent of good leather and clean cotton. He saw the respectful posture the hat held over the chest, the eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy. George leaned in closer, his face entering the pool of light cast by the bedside lamp. He offered a smile that was small, but carried the warmth of a Texas sunrise. He spoke, and his voice resonated through the sterile room, wrapping around Elias like a heavy wool blanket in the dead of winter. He said hello to Elias, calling him sir. He introduced himself simply as George, though no introduction was necessary. He told the old cowboy that he had heard about the fences he had built, the horses he had broken, and the honest life he had lived. He said that a man who dedicates his life to the land deserves the respect of every man who walks upon it. He told Elias that he was not alone, that his labor was not forgotten, and that the Lord was preparing a pasture for him where the grass was always green and the horses never tired. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The erratic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to slow, finding a steadier, calmer rhythm. A single tear escaped the corner of the old man's eye, tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of his weathered face. He tried to lift his hand to reach out to the legend standing beside him, but his strength failed him. George, seeing the effort, gently reached out and took Elias's rough, calloused hand in his own. The contrast was striking, but the connection was profound. Two men of the earth, one a global icon, the other an unknown laborer, united by a shared understanding of what it meant to be a true cowboy. George held the old man's hand with a firm, comforting grip, communicating a silent promise that he was seen, that he was valued, and that his life had mattered. From the other side of the bed, Dolly leaned over. Her presence was like a sudden burst of sunlight breaking through dark storm clouds. She reached out and gently stroked Elias's forehead, her touch as light as a feather. She looked down at him with eyes that held the deep spiritual wisdom of the Smoky Mountains. She spoke to him, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his soul. She told him that he had fought a good fight, that he had carried his burdens with grace, and that it was all right to be tired. She spoke of the angels waiting on the other side of the river, preparing a place of absolute peace, where there was no more pain, no more cold, and no more sorrow. She told him that God loved him and that the world was a better place because he had walked upon it. The profound dignity of the moment was overwhelming. Sarah, still kneeling on the floor, looked up at George and Dolly, her heart swelling with a gratitude so massive it felt as though it might burst from her chest. These two towering figures of American culture had paused their lives, had defied the rigid authority of the medical establishment simply to ensure that a dying ranch hand felt the warmth of human kindness in his final hours. They had stripped away the humiliation inflicted by Dr. Vance and restored Elias to his rightful status as a patriarch, a builder, and a man of honor. Outside the glass walls of room 412, the hallway had grown entirely still. Dr. Vance, who had followed them from the lobby, unable to let go of his wounded pride, stood a few feet away from the window, accompanied by the two security guards. He had come to the intensive care unit intending to assert his dominance, to find a reason to throw the intruders out and re-establish his absolute control over the ward. But as he stood there looking through the blinds, watching the scene unfold inside the room, he found himself entirely paralyzed. Vance watched as George Strait, the king of country music, stood, with his head bowed, holding the hand of a man Vance had dismissed as a worthless burden. He watched Dolly Parton, radiating a pure, unconditional love, touching the forehead of a patient Vance had barely bothered to look at during his rounds. He saw the profound peace settling over Elias's face, a peace that no medication, no machine, and no advanced medical procedure in Vance's vast arsenal could ever provide. For the first time in his meticulously planned, highly successful career, Dr. Vance felt a crushing sense of inadequacy. He looked at his expensive suit, his pristine white coat, his digital tablet filled with charts and statistics, and realized how utterly empty they were in the face of true human suffering. He had spent his life mastering the science of keeping the physical body alive, but he knew absolutely nothing about healing a soul. He had built a fortress of rules and protocols to protect himself from the messy reality of emotion, and in doing so, he had become a cold, mechanical functionary devoid of grace. The security guards standing beside Vance slowly lowered their hands from their utility belts. They too were captivated by the scene inside the room. They were working-class men, men who had fathers and grandfathers just like Elias, and they recognized the sacred nature of what was happening. They looked at Dr. Vance, waiting for an order, but the administrator had none to give. His authority had evaporated, not because he was overpowered, but because he was morally outmatched. He slowly lowered his head, unable to meet the gaze of Nurse Margaret, who stood by the door, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of pity and quiet defiance. Inside the room, Sarah remembered the plastic bag she was clutching. Her hands shaking, she opened it and pulled out a worn, dusty cassette tape. It was an old compilation of gospel hymns and traditional country ballads, the very tape Elias used to play in his truck every morning as they drove out to the pastures. She looked at George and Dolly, silently asking for permission. George nodded his eyes, encouraging her. Sarah reached over to a small battery-operated tape player she had smuggled into the room days ago, resting on the bedside table. She pushed the tape in and pressed play. The tiny speaker crackled to life, filling the sterile room with the faint static hiss of old magnetic tape, followed by the gentle strumming of an acoustic guitar. The music was raw, unpolished, and deeply authentic. It was the sound of the dirt roads, the open sky, and the unwavering faith of the country. Elias closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips. The rigid lines of pain on his face began to smooth out, replacing the agony with a profound, serene surrender. Dolly closed her eyes, listening to the melody. She recognized the hymn, an old song about crossing the Jordan River and finding rest on the other side. Without any accompaniment, without a microphone or a stage, Dolly began to sing. She did not sing with the full power of her legendary voice. She sang softly, harmonizing with the tape player, her voice blending with the crackling recording. It was a private, intimate performance, offered not for applause or accolades, but as a sacred offering to a departing soul. Her voice, pure and trembling with emotion, filled every corner of room 412. It seeped under the door and drifted out into the cold hallway. The nurses, standing at their stations, stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads. The patients in the nearby rooms who were awake lay still, letting the angelic sound wash over them. Even Dr. Vance, standing in the corridor, closed his eyes, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his throat, a sudden painful crack in the armor of his cynicism. George stood silently holding Elias's hand, his thumb gently tracing the rough calluses on the old man's knuckles. He did not sing, but his presence was a silent hymn of respect. He was the anchor holding the space, ensuring that nothing and no one would interrupt this sacred transition. He looked at Sarah, who was weeping freely now, not tears of despair, but tears of a profound, overwhelming release. The agonizing injustice of the past few weeks, the coldness of the hospital, the cruelty of the bureaucracy, all of it had been washed away. In its place was a beautiful, dignified grace. The music continued, a fragile bridge between the harsh reality of the hospital room and the vast, peaceful eternity waiting just beyond the veil. Elias's breathing grew shallower, but the struggle was gone. He was no longer a patient trapped in a machine. He was a cowboy riding out toward the sunset, surrounded by the music of his life and the respect of his heroes. The city, with all its arrogance and its cold, hard rules, had tried to break him. But in the end, the enduring spirit of the country, the unyielding power of faith, empathy, and human connection had claimed the final victory. The final notes of the old gospel hymn drifted through the cold air of the intensive care unit, like golden dust settling over a quiet battlefield. The cheap plastic tape player clicked as the cassette reached its end, but the silence that followed was not the oppressive mechanical void that had haunted the room for weeks. It was a holy silence, a thick, reverent stillness that seemed to hold the breath of angels. Dolly Parton leaned back slightly, her hand still resting gently on Elias's forehead, her eyes shining with unshed tears that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, turning them into soft stars. George Strait stood like a sentinel of the Old West, his head still bowed, his strong, weathered hand completely enveloping the frail, trembling fingers of the dying cowboy. Elias drew a breath that sounded different from the others. It was no longer a desperate struggle against the fluid filling his lungs or a fight against the heavy weight of his failing heart. It was a sigh of profound surrender. The deep, agonizing lines that had been carved into his face by pain and exhaustion smoothed out entirely, revealing the handsome, dignified ranch hand he had been in his youth. His eyelids fluttered, and for the first time in days, he opened his eyes fully. The cloudy haze of morphine and encroaching death had vanished. His gaze was crystal clear. He did not look at the ceiling or the terrifying medical machinery that had imprisoned him. He looked directly into the eyes of his granddaughter. Sarah, kneeling on the hard linoleum floor, felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of warmth. The fear that had gripped her chest for a month evaporated. Elias looked at her with a love so pure and absolute that it transcended the physical boundaries of the room. He was telling her without a single word that he was no longer afraid that the pain was gone, and that he was ready to ride out into the great open prairie of eternity. He shifted his gaze to Dolly, offering a faint, microscopic nod of gratitude for the lullaby that had guided him through the valley of the shadow. Finally, his eyes moved to George Strait, the king of country music, met the old cowboy's gaze with unwavering respect. There was no pity in George's eyes, only the deep, solemn recognition of one working man honoring another at the end of a long, hard trail. George gave Elias's hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. Elias's lips parted slightly, and though no sound emerged, the shape of his mouth formed a silent thank you. He closed his eyes one last time. A profound, absolute peace washed over his weathered features. The erratic, frantic rhythm of the heart monitor slowed down to a steady, deliberate pace, and then, with the quiet dignity of a sun slipping below the Texas horizon, it leveled out into a single, continuous tone. Elias was gone. He had slipped the surly bonds of the cold city and returned to the earth he had loved so fiercely. The continuous tone of the monitor should have sounded like a harsh alarm, a jarring scream of medical failure, but in that sacred space, it sounded only like a gentle trumpet calling a weary soldier home. Sarah buried her face in the thin hospital blankets, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her grief, but her tears were no longer born of despair. They were tears of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. Her grandfather had not died as a forgotten number in a sterile machine. He had passed away surrounded by the music of his soul, the touch of a loving granddaughter, and the profound respect of two legends who had crossed the state simply to ensure he was not alone. Outside the glass walls of room 412, the hallway remained entirely paralyzed. The nurses, the orderlies, and the security guards stood frozen, their heads bowed in silent tribute. Dr. Vance, the architect of the hospital's cold bureaucracy, stood by the window, his hands trembling at his sides. The continuous tone of the flatline pierced through the thick glass cutting straight into the core of his meticulously constructed armor. For years he had viewed death as an enemy to be fought with charts, medications, and rigid protocols. He had viewed patients as battlegrounds and families as obstacles. But watching the profound, majestic grace of Elias's passing, he realized with crushing clarity that death was not merely a medical event. It was a sacred transition, a deeply human milestone that required empathy, not just efficiency. Dr. Vance slowly raised his hand and pushed the heavy glass door open. He did not stride into the room with his usual arrogant authority. He stepped over the threshold with the hesitant reverence of a man entering a cathedral. He looked at Nurse Margaret, who had followed him inside, her eyes red but fierce with protective loyalty. Vance did not reprimand her. He did not mention the broken protocols or the bypassed security systems. He walked quietly to the side of the bed opposite George and Dolly. He reached out and with a surprisingly gentle touch turned off the blaring alarm of the heart monitor, allowing the holy silence to return to the room. He looked down at Elias's peaceful face, and then he looked at Sarah. The administrator swallowed hard, the tight knot of his own pride finally dissolving in his throat. He spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, stripped entirely of its former condescension. He offered his deepest condolences to Sarah, his words stumbling slightly as he navigated the unfamiliar territory of genuine human empathy. He told her that her grandfather was a man of immense strength, and that it had been an honor, however poorly he had shown it, to have him in their care. Sarah looked up from the blankets, her eyes searching Dr. Vance's face. She saw the profound shift in his demeanor, the crumbling of his arrogant facade. She did not offer him anger or resentment. She simply nodded, accepting his apology with the quiet, stoic grace she had inherited from the man lying in the bed. George Strait gently placed Elias's hand back onto the bed, resting it over the old cowboy's heart. He took a step back and placed his Stetson back upon his head, the gesture signaling the end of his silent vigil. He looked at Dr. Vance, his eyes holding a firm but merciful judgment. He did not need to lecture the doctor. The lesson had already been taught by the silent dignity of the dead. George simply told Dr. Vance that a hospital is a place for healing, but sometimes the only healing left to do is for the souls of the living. He asked the doctor to remember the man in the bed the next time a family from the country came through his doors, terrified and alone. Dr. Vance nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the floor. He knew that his life, his career, and his entire understanding of medicine had been irrevocably altered in the span of a single hour. Dolly Parton wrapped her arms around Sarah, pulling the young woman into a deep maternal embrace. She held her tightly, letting Sarah cry against her shoulder, whispering words of comfort and promises of eternal peace. She told Sarah that Elias was riding the finest horse in heaven, now free from pain and bathed in the golden light of the Lord. She wiped the tears from Sarah's cheeks and kissed her forehead, leaving behind the faint, comforting scent of mountain wildflowers. With their mission of mercy complete, George and Dolly turned to leave. They walked out of room 412, moving back down the long, sterile corridor. But the hallway did not feel cold anymore. The nurses and doctors parted respectfully, creating a silent guard of honor for the departing legends. Nurse Margaret stood by the nurses' station, her head held high, tears streaming down her face. George paused as he passed her, tipping his hat in a gesture of profound respect, acknowledging the courage it had taken for her to open that door. Dolly squeezed Margaret's hand, thanking her for having a heart big enough to see the humanity in a broken system. They walked into the elevator and descended to the lobby, leaving the fortress of glass and steel behind them. As they stepped out through the automatic doors into the early hours of the morning, the city was still dark, but a faint line of deep purple and gold was beginning to break across the eastern horizon. The air was cool and carried the distant promise of rain. George walked to his truck, the heavy leather of his boots striking the pavement with the steady rhythm of a man at peace with his conscience. He opened the door for Dolly, offering her a quiet smile of mutual understanding. They had not come to the city to change the world. They had come to honor one man, but in doing so, they had reminded an entire institution of what it truly meant to care for the human soul. The aftermath of that night rippled through the hospital like a quiet revolution. Dr. Vance was a changed man. The arrogance that had defined his career was replaced by a solemn, dedicated empathy. In the weeks and months that followed, the staff noticed that he spent more time sitting by the bedsides of his patients, listening to their stories rather than just reading their charts. He quietly dismantled the draconian visitation rules, ensuring that no family would ever again be kept away from their loved ones in their final hours. Nurse Margaret was promoted to head of patient advocacy, a position created specifically by Dr. Vance to ensure that the emotional and spiritual needs of the patients were treated with the same urgency as their physical ailments. The culture of the intensive care unit transformed from a cold mechanical assembly line into a sanctuary of compassionate care, all because a country singer and a mountain queen had refused to let a cowboy die without his dignity. 6 months later, the harsh heat of the Texas summer had softened into the golden, hazy warmth of autumn. Out on the sprawling plains, miles away from the towering skyscrapers and the roaring traffic of the city, the dirt roads stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of dry grass, sweet cedar, and the metallic tang of an approaching evening thunderstorm. Sarah stood by the main wooden gate of the ranch, her worn leather boots planted firmly in the red dirt. She was wearing her grandfather's old denim jacket, the sleeves rolled up the fabric, soft and faded from years of hard labor. The ranch was quiet, the horses grazing peacefully in the distance, their tails swishing lazily in the warm breeze. The profound, agonizing grief of losing Elias had slowly transformed into a deep, quiet pride. She had brought him home, burying him under the shade of a massive ancient oak tree on the highest hill of the property, overlooking the pastures he had tended for over half a century. She reached out and ran her hand along the rough, splintered wood of the main fence post. Embedded into the heavy timber, right where the sun caught it perfectly at the golden hour of the evening, was a small, solid brass plaque. Sarah had spent her last few dollars having it made a permanent testament to the man who had built this sanctuary. The engraving was simple, devoid of any grand titles or boastful claims. It read, "Elias, a true cowboy. He rode with honor. He worked with grace. He rests in peace." But the plaque was not the only thing adorning the old fence post. Tucked carefully behind the brass plate, protected from the harsh Texas wind and the heavy rains, was a small piece of folded parchment paper. The paper was thick and creamy, covered in elegant flowing handwriting that carried the warmth of the Smoky Mountains. It was a letter that had arrived in the mail a few weeks after the funeral, unprompted and deeply personal. Dolly had written to Sarah telling her that she thought of Elias often, that his quiet strength had touched her heart, and that she prayed for the continued prosperity of the ranch. The letter was a tangible reminder that the love they had brought into that cold hospital room was not a fleeting performance but a genuine enduring connection. And pressed firmly into the wood just below the brass plaque, catching the fading rays of the setting sun, was a single dark guitar pick. It bore the unmistakable silver signature of George Strait. It had arrived in a small unmarked envelope with no return address and no accompanying letter. None was needed. It was a silent, stoic tribute from one man of the earth to another, a symbol of the unspoken brotherhood that binds those who understand the value of a hard day's work and the sanctity of a promise kept. Sarah looked at the pick and smiled, her eyes reflecting the brilliant orange and pink hues of the Texas sunset. She turned and looked out over the vast expanse of the ranch. She could almost hear the faint, rhythmic thud of heavy boots walking across the porch and the gentle, melancholic strumming of an old acoustic guitar drifting on the wind. The city had tried to erase him. The bureaucracy had tried to strip him of his worth, but standing there under the boundless open sky, Sarah knew the truth. The legacy of a man is not measured by the size of his bank account, the prestige of his doctors, or the cold efficiency of the machines that monitor his final breaths. It is measured by the fences he builds to protect his family, the sweat he pours into the earth, and the quiet, unwavering faith that guides him through the darkest valleys. It is measured by the respect he commands from those who truly understand the weight of a life well lived. Elias had left this world not as a forgotten patient, but as a king of the plains, honored by legends and carried home on the wings of an old gospel hymn. Sarah pulled her grandfather's denim jacket a little tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the deep, rich scent of the approaching rain. She turned away from the gate and began the long walk back toward the farmhouse, her steps steady and strong, echoing with the enduring, unbreakable spirit of the country. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final golden glow over the brass plaque, the handwritten note and the silver signature on the guitar pick, leaving the ranch bathed in the peaceful, quiet grace of a magnificent Texas twilight.